I've been talking about it and talking about it and talking about it. For how long? Well, it feels like a decade, but it's been more like 2 years. Today, all of you finally get to hear about the first stats arising from the creation of the database. I'm Ed Denzel, and this is Unfound. This episode is going to be a bit wonky, kind of technical, lots of numbers, which I know is horrible given that this is an audio format. So I realize some of you will be turned off by the whole thing. There's no interview, there's no disappearance circumstances, there's no narrative or story, there are no theories to ponder. Yet, if you decide to stick it out, what you will hear today is just as important as any missing persons case featured on this podcast. Why? Because through these stats, I believe resolutions to the still unresolved cases can be found. Not just unfounds, but all disappearances. In fact, by accumulation and analysis of these stats, I think it's possible to stop disappearances before they occur. Because we have to remember, unlike gravity, light, and the universe itself, disappearances don't have to exist. They don't have to happen. And they surely don't have to remain unresolved. Then the question is, what can be done to make that happen? Even if we understand theoretically that we may never get to perfection. And along the way, we might even find out why so many things tried to this point don't work. And now a summary of how the database came to be. And I should tell you right now, for the rest of the podcast, I'm just going to be using notes. I don't have a script necessarily in front of me with full sentences, so please be forgiving if you hear some you-knows and ums and pauses like that. It all started when I watched the movie Moneyball. I did not see it when it originally came out. Was it 2011 or something like that? But I saw it 2018, 2019, somewhere in there. And I would not say that the first time I saw it is this idea came into my head. But since then, I've seen the movie many times. But somewhere in all of that, I don't know if it was a third time seeing that movie on TV or what. And I've also read the book. I started thinking and convincing myself that there were stats within this world of disappearances that are unseen. Because that's, if you don't know, for all you non-baseball fans out there, Moneyball was first a book, and then it was a movie about an A's team that was put together using stats, baseball stats, that had never been used before, and in fact discarded and not respected by the rest of the league. And Billy Beane, the general manager for the Oakland A's who did this, was motivated to do this because he could not compete with the Red Sox, the Yankees, the Dodgers, other teams who were willing to spend a ton of money to get players. He had to find another way to be competitive. And the way he discovered that was from something called Sabermetrics, a book, a study that had been done years before that regarding baseball by a guy, I think his name was Bill James, I think. He came upon this idea, and that is how he ended up putting together an Oakland A's team in the mid-2000s that did pretty well. Now today, 20 years later, this stuff is accepted as just being, when you start seeing stats like, OPS and slugging percentage and OPS plus and a lot of these other things you see on your screen when you're watching baseball, outside of ERA and runs batted in and batting average, when you start seeing these other stats that you may not have seen before, that kind of comes from the sabermetrics world of baseball. And they are stats that had never been used before. It was a different way of putting a team together. It was information that already existed, but was unused or underused and certainly underappreciated. And the main idea is baseball wins are most closely associated with runs scored, not with hits or RBIs and things like that. And until that point, that is the way baseball was thought of. More hits means more runs means more wins. Not necessarily. It's just a very, very general overview. And you should know the movie, I think, is great. I know Brad Pitt was up for an Academy Award. Did he win it? I don't even know. But the book is also excellent, although it gets way, way deeper into the stats and numbers. The movie kind of stays away from that. It's more of just a regular baseball movie. And there are some artistic licenses that were used in the movie that things don't necessarily match up totally to what actually happened in real life. But if you see the movie, you'll understand what I'm saying here. But unless you're a really, really, really deep baseball fan, you probably don't need to read the book. All I can tell you is that at some point, sitting on my couch, I can't remember whether it was down in Madeira Beach or up here in Clearwater Beach where I live now, it occurred to me. It just came to me. I was like, I'm pretty sure there's something within all of these disappearance stats and facts and everything else that you can put together to understand disappearances in a new way, in a better way, to cut down on the occurrences of them. In addition, that leads to more resolutions for them. I convinced myself of that over time. What this also was combined with was, as you know, it's not enough for me to just do this podcast. You think about, of course, I do the live show on Monday nights. I'm one of the few podcasters who also does a live show that is separate from the podcast. Of course, I had a newsletter for a while. I did the books for a while. You know about my speaking engagements. I do a lot of other things concerning disappearances that is outside of just doing the podcast, of interviewing people, recording their interviews, and playing them for all of you. And in fact, I would say, once again, that I'm very, very unique in that respect, I think. I've really thrown my entire self into disappearances and knowing them, learning them, understanding them, and being able to pass on that knowledge to all of you, to my guests, whoever else, and I continue to learn myself. So that also, coming upon that with Moneyball, kind of went right along with that kind of thinking that I already had, that I wanted to continue to do things outside of just doing the podcast. The good news is that going back to my college years over 30 years ago, I did not, even though I did very, very well in high school, in college I did not do so well, mainly because I didn't like to study too much. Truthfully. But I went to a very difficult school as well. That should be added in there. But one of the courses in which I did very, very well without a lot of work was a stats class. A very, very otherwise difficult stats class. In fact, I think in my entire 4 years in college, it's the only A I ever got. I think that's a true story. I'm pretty sure about that. And in fact, I did a group project my senior year. My team, there was 2 other guys. We did this. We were the only group to get an A on this project that we had to do throughout the course of the semester. And the study was how we looked at the stock market and we showed how competitors' stocks follow the same general track despite each company trying to put each other out of business. competitive companies. I don't even know. We probably were looking at I don't know, Kmart and some competitor to Kmart back in the early 1990s or something like that. McDonald's, Burger King, things like that. And even though they're trying to put each other out of business and marketing against each other and everything else, we showed that over time, and we were able to go back to the 50s or whatever and chart, they basically just go the same. They're really not having that much effect on each other. And we got an A on the project. And by the way, I was the guy who came up with that idea. So this whole thing about putting this database together, accumulating stats, and the way my mind works, right up my alley. And certainly having done this now, I've been working on this, of course, with a lot of help, and I'm going to mention those people here eventually. I thought, man, this really feels right with something that goes along with my mind. As I've said many times, don't ask me to manage people, but you ask me to manage information. I'm pretty good at that. Also, NamUs. It's a nice list. I'm glad it exists. I'm glad the federal government in the United States has this list, even though I know that it has a lot of mistakes, and I know there are a lot of disappearances that aren't on there. But NamUs doesn't tell you anything about disappearances. In fact, for purposes of studying disappearances and learning about them, it's basically useless. Yes, it has height, weight. You can go there. Most of you I know have been to NamUs at least once. It's fine information, but really, it's just a list. It's just a list. And it's not useful for you, the public, to solve disappearances. And even people I know who've tried to use the unidentified remains section of it and the missing persons section of it, trying to match it all up. I don't know of anybody who's successfully done that. I've tried it myself years and years ago with no success. So it's good to have a list like that to know who is actually missing. But if you're actually going to try to use that to study disappearances, it's not going to be useful. It's just not. You don't learn anything about disappearances by selecting the different criteria there. Like you can pick a certain state, certain age, certain county. That's all very interesting. But it's not helpful if you're looking to stop disappearances or resolve disappearances or see trends in disappearances and things like that. It's just not helpful. For example, it doesn't even, as we know, addiction and mental health issues play a huge role in, as we're going to see later, in disappearances. There is no way to search for that on NamUs. There's no box to click regarding that. This is what I'm talking about. So I saw some flaws in NamUs in using it as much as I did, and saw I think there's an opportunity to do something more. Now, as far as the database itself, piggybacking off of NamUs, this database that has been put together has 33 different criteria. Now, some of them are the same as NamUs, yes, like date and state and city, yes. But I would say, I don't have the number in front of me, at least 25 of the criteria, NamUs does not account for at all. For example, is a person's phone missing or not? Is a car missing or not? Did a car go missing with the person as well? Who was the last person to see that missing person? Stuff like that. That is all in the Unfound database. And although it very well may be it's written like in the description for some disappearances on NamUs, it's not something that is required for a disappearance to be put on NamUs. Whereas in the Unfound database, all of this criteria, if it is known, must be entered. And I'll give you some examples here. So for some of the criteria that you will find on the Unfound database that you won't find on NamUs. As I keep saying, disappearances are all about people, not circumstances. So some of the criteria has to do, of course, with the missing people. For example, what was the person's relationship status? You will not find that on NamUs. You will find it in the Unfound database. Did this person suffer from mental illness? We'll get into this more in depth later. That's in the Unfound database, not on NamUs. Addictions, not on NamUs, although it can be written in the description or something, but you can't check it off. So you can't search for it on NamUs. You can search for it in the Unfound database. How about the person's education? Did they graduate from high school? Did they graduate from college? Things like that. Not on the NamUs database. It is in the Unfound database, and we're going to get into that later, but you're going to see that part of this episode is going to be very eye-opening. So those are some things about the people. What about the circumstances? Simply day or night. Did the person go missing at day or night? Very simply, was the sun up or was the sun down? Not on NamUs. It is in the Unfound database. Who was the last witness that we believe? Who is taking credit, let's put it that way, for who's taking credit for seeing the missing persons last? On the Unfound database, not on NamUs. How long did the person take to be reported missing? Not on NamUs, of course, certainly in the Unfound database. You can search for that. And something like cell phone records. Do we have the cell phone records for that missing person? Of course, if cell phone records are relevant. Just some examples. But like I said, a total of 33 pieces of information must be entered into any disappearance that is put into the Unfound database, even though there's some things that maybe are unknown still. NamUs, and of those, maybe NamUs has 8 of them at the most. Because there's nothing in here about height and weight, eye color. I just don't think any of that is relevant at all to studying disappearances. And really, once we get to a disappearances that is more than a week old, height, weight, those things, not relevant at all. I think we've seen that. It's one of the main reasons when we get into all the disappearances that have been featured on Unfound, we don't talk about height and weight and tattoos and things. They're just not relevant. They're just not. So I don't include them. I don't include them in interviews. I know there are pictures out there. I know Megan over at the Charlie Project includes things like that. But for purposes of study and learning about disappearances, not relevant. So moving on, of course, the problem is collecting that info. And I was the one who sat down over a period of time a few years ago and said, well, what do I suspect is relevant? Because you got to start somewhere. And that's where it started coming up with addiction, relationships, locations. Is it country? Is it city? Who was the last person to see the missing person? What all seems to be relevant that would be the best criteria for understanding a disappearance? Really, really, really understanding. And eventually what that became was the criteria I have, how I put disappearances into different categories. The man said, drugs play a role, the art of luring, those things that I've talked about once in a while. So coming up with the criteria, took some time. It really did. And I'm certainly open to the idea that more criteria needs to be added into the database. Certainly. I would say probably. But 33 pieces of criteria is a good place to start. So we have to collect that info. And what's been very interesting to me is recently I've been reading this book. I've been reading this book from the UK. It's just called Missing Persons. It's a big book. A bunch of studies are in it and everything. What's interesting to me is here I am about to make this database public. And what I think is important in understanding disappearances, and this book hardly gets into any of what I think is important. So there's that. But I still, of course, think I'm right. I'm not. I have to be honest. I'm not really been that impressed with this book. I'm not saying that a lot of work wasn't put into this book. I'm not saying there are any fallacies in this book. I'm not saying somebody who reads this book isn't going to get something out of it. But if you're already neck deep in disappearances like I am, and that's all you do, and have read thousands of pieces of information, the Charlie Project, name it, certain blogs, listening to other podcasts, reading newspapers.com, on and on and on. If you've read so much and taken in so much that I have over the last 9 years about disappearances, maybe even before that, because I've always taken interest in them, you don't get a ton out of this book. Whereas I'm hoping that people who take an interest in disappearances, who already think they know a lot about them, will be able to use this database, and it will be really eye-opening to them. I'm hoping. That's what I hope. So the issue was, how do you go about collecting 33 pieces of information on 380-some disappearances that have been featured on Unfound? But you should know this work started a while ago, so we weren't at 385. We might have only been at 300 when this started. Well, I found a listener. I'm not going to say her full name, but she's a woman. She's been a supporter of Unfound, I think since about 2019, something like that. She's in the think tank. I've gotten to know her very well, although she and I have never met in person. But I just simply, she probably remembers this. She's listening to this right now. I just called her up one day. And I said, Kathy, I have an idea. And I need somebody to do this. Can you do it for me? And it was volunteer status. Asked her to do it in her spare time when she could get to it. But knowing her like I do in the think tank, she's the work that she's retired now, but the work she had when she was fully employed, I think went very well along with this particular job. And even when it comes to disappearances and looking at her job that she used to have is very good at looking disappearances as well. And I told her, this is what I need. Can you do it? And I don't remember if she automatically said yes, but eventually she started working on it. And I cannot thank her enough. She essentially did about the first 2/3. And what does that mean? She had to go way back to the first episode of Unfound, Susie Lyle, and start working her way through every episode, compiling these 33 pieces of information for every episode. Now, granted, some of the criteria maybe is not relevant to particular episodes, especially when we talk about cell phones and things like, if we go back to the 1980s disappearances or whatever. But most of the information is relevant in every disappearance. As you can imagine, a huge task. But I'm going to tell you, she did about the first 2/3. So I think she did a little over 200 of the episodes, maybe 250, somewhere in there. I don't have it written down in my notes. But she did a fantastic job. And she was like, I think that's enough. And I agree with her, that was plenty. And so a ton of information, ton of information on this criteria that I came up with off the top of my head after, thinking about it for a long time. Gave her the list. Here's what I need. She did it fantastic. And then I took over and I did the final roughly 1/3 myself. Going back through these episodes, the last 1/3 up until the present, I think the last disappearance that got included in this database is Leo Wagner's. So I went through the last 1/3 and did the rest of it myself. So that's what I've been doing in my spare time. So this information all got collected into, and I put it in Kathy's information, the information that I got, put it into a huge spreadsheet, Excel spreadsheet. And then, very fortunately, I know a guy who I've known since I think 2013. He's about 20 years younger than I am. We first played disc golf together way back in 2013. We've become very, very good friends. He's a really, really good guy. I wish I was as conscientious as he is at 20 years ago. But he is an Excel whiz due to the work that he does. And I said, Cameron, can you help me with this? I need this Excel spreadsheet with all this criteria turned into a kind of database that can be searched where you just kind of click off boxes, something like that. That's what I need. Can you do it? And this year he started working on it, and that is what you're eventually all going to be able to see eventually. It's still not public yet. So I had Kathy compile a ton of the information. I did the rest of the information, took that information, gave it to this very, very good friend of mine, Cameron, who has experience in this area, although not in disappearances and something totally different. And he put it into a form that people can use to just go through it and click off certain things, and certain disappearances will appear. So you have all of Unfound's disappearances, and you click off certain things. Well, I want to see all the disappearances of women. Boom. I want to see all the disappearances of women between the ages of 25 and 40. Boom. And you can just combine all of it. Women between 25 and 40 where their cars are also missing. Boom. And it'll keep narrowing and narrowing and narrowing the list down. And this will make more sense when I do a YouTube video to show how to use it. But it's just exactly as I imagined when I first came up with this idea, going way back to when I was watching Moneyball, because it's even to this day it's on TV all the time. Watching that movie on TV and saying, this needs to be done for disappearances. So this has been like 5 years in the making or something, like probably around COVID or maybe before that. And finally, it now exists. And you're going to get to hear about some of the first stats that have been gathered. This is only completely like Disappearances 101. It is just scratching the surface. I guess theoretically, you could almost do any kind of search on this database. And so what I'm going to be talking about for the rest of the time here is really, really, really just the basics. But I think it's fantastic. But I got to do something first. Unfound news. Another unfound disappearance has seemingly been resolved. Zach Carey, who went missing from Linville, Indiana in 2023. His remains were found by accident by hunters. No foul play is suspected. Our deepest sympathies go to his friends and family. Next, did you catch my appearance on Dr. T's show on her YouTube channel yesterday? I went over a more generalized version of what you were about to hear regarding Unfound's stats on disappearances. Finally, the next Unfound Now is out, where I look at the August 2025 disappearance of James Cole. Please find it on Unfound's YouTube channel. Okay then, back to this database. How am I going to do this? I want to reiterate, these are essentially the entry-level stats. And I myself have only been able to play with this database so far a little bit, but so there's a lot to be done. And in fact, this is why I want to get it made public as quickly as possible. Still tweaking a few things because I want everybody to be able to play around with it. Of course, it's not a toy, but I think you know what I mean. I think the more hands-on use of it is going to expose what I'm looking for. Those patterns, what we all should be looking for. Those patterns, those tendencies, seeing things that about disappearances that can't just be seen by reading, going to NamUs, or reading page after page on the Charlie Project. Very much, once again, like going back to the Moneyball example, where the information's right there, but is it being seen? And if it's being seen, how can it be used? It's the same thing. So this is let's just call today's episode Disappearance Stats 101, the entry level course, like Economics 101. There will be a lot more to come as I learn how to combine different criteria to find the message inside the noise. That's kind of a statistics term. And yes, like I said, the database will eventually be made public so you can find the proverbial hidden trends and causations and correlations as well. And I should also state, before I get into this, given that I have so many numbers, there's going to be a lot of numbers coming up. I'm going to incorporate some of Unfound's disappearances as examples as I go through this, so it will add context to what I'm saying. All right, I just want you to think the rest of this is going to be percentages. I'm going to talk about some of the disappearances that are kind of connected to these stats as well, and then I think that will kind of maybe hopefully tick something off in your mind. Oh yeah, I remember that disappearance, and then some of this will make a little more sense because, like I said, doing numbers in an audio format a little tough. But I'm going to do my best. But I'm doing this because it's very important. I want you to know about it because it's going to be coming out soon. I want you to use it. I'm going to do a video on how to use it. And like I said, this isn't just something for me. It's not just something for families. It's not just something for my assistants or other people like Dr. Telesco or Julia Colley. I want this to be for everybody. I think this is going to be a spectacular learning tool. And I think where it's going to be, it's going to be on the newly refurbished website once I figure out how to put it there. But that's where it's going to be, theunfoundpodcast.com, but it's not there yet. All right, let's get into these stats. We're just going to start out with some of the easy ones. There are 385 disappearances, and this would mean some of those disappearances where, for example, Chance Wackerhagen and Dub Wackerhagen, those would consider to be individual disappearances. Chance Wackerhagen is one, Dub Wackerhagen is another. As an example, Peggy and Patty McDaniel, even though they were in the same episode as sisters, they are considered to be themselves one disappearance. So between Peggy and Patty, it's actually two disappearances, even though it's one episode. So when I say 385 disappearances, I mean individuals. However, there are a few caveats. First of all, of course, Flight 370, not included for obvious reasons. 300 some people on a jet, and it's really, although I take a great interest in plane disappearances and all sorts of kinds of disappearances, not relevant to what I'm doing here. I will also tell you that the Pickering 6, remember the 6 Canadian young men who went missing, seemingly out on, Lake Erie, Lake Ontario? Not included because they're all basically the same, and that might skew the results. That is nothing against them or their families. Of course, that episode still exists. Unfortunately, the guest for that episode died within the last couple years, very sadly. But for purposes of this database, they were not included because they're all basically disappearing at the same time, same location, and it just skewed it, in my opinion, would skew things just a little too much. However, on the other hand, the 3 Canadian young men who disappeared here in Florida back in the 1990s, Omar Shearer and his friends, they are included simply because it's only 3. Like I said, I don't know where you draw the line. It just seemed like 3 could be included, but 6 was too much, just so you know. The general stats continuing on here. We have disappearances that go from 1945, of course, with Mary Jane Van Gilder, up to 2024 with Anthony Reyes, which, of course, is a very recent episode. The countries that are included are, of course, the United States, Canada, Wales, remember Lee Trevelyan Evans, New Zealand, Athol Turner, and you might remember also Angola with Ben Padilla. You remember him. So those are the countries that are included. We have not done any disappearances, at least for the podcast, from Mexico or Germany, France, although I have certainly talked about some disappearances from those countries on the live show and elsewhere. But for purposes of this database, it's only the podcast that comes out every Friday. So those are the only countries included. There are 322 Americans on this list. The next, of course, common citizen is Canada. And as I've already stated, with Wales, it was Trevelyan Evans. With New Zealand, Athol Turner. And then we had an American who disappeared over in Africa as well. The average age of a person who is being featured on Unfound is 30 and a half years old. 30 and a half. So to give you an idea of, well, what does that mean? People right around that age of 30, 31 years old. Jace Martin. Remember, he was it his girlfriend? He walked off, never to be seen again. Richard Riesenberg, going back to the 1970s. Remember, he was the guy who murdered his wife and child, and then he was in that hospital, and then he ran off with a woman. They're both still missing. Richard Riesenberg, 31 years old when he took off. You remember Paige Rinkowski, 31 years old. Of course, she went missing in Michigan, car found on the side of the road. And you also then might also remember who was 31 at the time of her disappearance, Lisa Marie Green. So these are, if you know those names, if those names are familiar to you, they are the average age of a person featured on Unfound. The oldest person was Betty Tepfer, 87 years old, who went missing from, where was it? Riverside, California. Remember that? That was a disappearance featured within the last couple years. She was 87. The youngest was Jeremy Degas. Remember, he disappeared with his mother right over here in the Tampa area many years ago, and he was only 4 months old. So it ranges, the average is 30 and a half years, but the age range is 4 months to 87 years old. Now you're wondering maybe about gender. Like I said, this is the bare minimum stats right now. This is a very, very, just barely scratching the surface of Unfound stats. Unfound is featured 179 males and 205 206 women. So more women than men by a considerable margin. Now, what is interesting about this? If you were to go to NamUs, there are many more men than women on NamUs. Now, why is that? Why the discrepancy? What is going on here? I think what's going on, my perception, is that it could be the families of missing women maybe just are a little more involved in the women's disappearances than on the men's disappearances, because we have to remember that with women, if they're disappearing, it's much more likely that they were murdered by the man in their life, whereas with men, certainly we might be open to that. Certainly we've covered some disappearances where that happened. But not as common. It very well may be that the women's families are thinking somebody got away from something, so they might be more likely to do a podcast. So it could be skewed. Now, like I said, going back to NamUs, way more men than women are missing, at least on that list. So what is the overall picture of disappearances? Let's just keep this to the United States. I'm guessing that it's probably somewhere in the middle between it being skewed one way with NamUs and being skewed the other way with the work that we do here at Unfound. But the stats are 179 men, 206 women, and that doesn't match up with NamUs, and you may come up with your own reasons for that. So how many adults? We already did the average age of 30 and a half, but 333 out of the 385 are adults. And half of the people featured on Unfound are between the ages of 21 and 40, which isn't a surprise to me at all. We're really in that meaty section of 21 to 40. Of course, that's 20 years there. So adults, 333 out of 385. And half of those adults are between 21 and 40 years old. How many are unresolved? Well, it's come up recently, of course, with I just mentioned Zach Carey. His disappearance being resolved. Most recently, also Jesse Farber and, of course, Chance Engelbert. We had 3 just within like the last, 5 weeks, something like that. But 89% of Unfound's disappearances since they've been featured on Unfound are still unresolved. The other 11% have been resolved to one point or another, and that is a criteria within the database that you can find out which ones are somewhat resolved and what does that actually mean. It's not simply yes or no. It's everything, the person has been found, no foul play. Somebody has gone to jail, but the body hasn't been found, like a Unique Harris, for example. And we have those ones also like Tom Brown. Remains found, but there's still work to be done. All of that can be checked off as a criteria within the Unfound database. But for the ones that are fully no answers at all, unfortunately, it's 89% of them. But like I said, that percentage was like 91% not too long ago. Okay, next section, reporting. This is something, once again, I'm not sure that this has ever been studied anywhere. If it's in any book, it's certainly not in the book, the UK book I'm reading right now. Maybe there's something out there. Maybe some particular police department has records of this for their own calls or reports or something. But overall, I don't know if something like this has been done. So what is the average time that it is taken for an unfound disappearance to be reported? So this isn't when somebody first realized somebody was missing, but the actual calling the police, going to the police, and the report actually being filled out. Now, before I give you this number, you should know I had to... Well, the problem you have with something like this is, as all of you know, we have some disappearances that nobody reported the people missing for years, like very recently, for example, like Benjamin Ridley, who wasn't reported missing for a long time. If you include that in a study, it is so outside of the norm, it can really skew what you're really trying to study. when you get a bunch of disappearances where the reports are usually done within a few days or a week or something, and then you get something a report wasn't done for 20 years, you can understand how it just completely skews the average. And I don't want that to happen. And we have a few like that. So any disappearance that wasn't reported as a disappearance for more than a year is not included. It gets a particular mark within the database where its number is not calculated. In fact, there's not even a number in that space in the database. So the spreadsheet, if you were to look at the actual raw spreadsheet that I have, in that particular section of the spreadsheet, there's not even a number there. Even if I know what the number is, let's say it's 3 years, it's not included. It's just not. So that needs to be noted. Any disappearance that took over a year to be reported, not included. In addition, because I wanted to be a little more accurate than days would be, I used hours. So for a disappearance that took a day to be reported, instead of putting one day, I put 24 hours. And of course, we have some that are 6 hours, or like Tiffany Johnson, she was noted to be missing within like an hour and a half, and the police were called like within a couple hours. That's why I wanted that flexibility to put hours instead of days. I suppose I could have put like 0.5, it was like half a day or something, but I decided to just go with hours. So when you use the database eventually, and you want to see, I want to see all disappearances that were reported between 1 day and 5 days. Well, you do that by putting in the hour equivalent. So that would be between 24 hours and 120 hours. So what is the average reported time? It's 140 hours is the average. Once again, keeping the ones over a year out of it. For all the other ones put together, 140 hours, that's about 5.8 days is the average. Of course, it's the average. Now, what are some of the disappearances that took around that time to be reported? Like 5 to 6 days. Jansen Brewer and Daniel Braden, the 2 disappearances. Those guys disappeared together. I don't mention them much, but took people 5 to 6 days to report them missing. On the other hand, a disappearance that I mentioned quite a bit, Cameron Remmer, 5 to 6 days. Robbie Hurt, of course, his was resolved, 5 to 6 days. Julie C., S-C-A-Y. Remember, an Asian-American young woman who went missing here in Florida, most probably murdered. The reporting for her disappearance, 5 to 6 days. Another young woman going missing in Florida, Lacey Buenfil, and actually went up to where she disappeared from the Altoona, Florida area some years ago. Lacey Buenfil also took 5 to 6 days to report her missing. But I should also mention that at least for some of the disappearances that Unfound is featured, it could not exactly be determined. Depending on who I was interviewing, some of the guests simply didn't know how long it took for that person to be missing. So those ones also cannot be included because we just don't know, and I don't want to guess. Still, a substantial number of the disappearances featured on Unfound, we do know how long it took, and so all of those are included as long as the reporting time was less than a year. But you may be wondering, well, how many took over like 200 hours? It's like, 8 days, somewhere in there, 8 to 9 days. How many took over 200 hours to be reported? Once again, leaving out ones that are over a year. So anything over 8 days, but less than a year. 45 out of 385 disappearances featured on Unfound. 45 of them took between 9 days and 365 days to be reported. So there you go, if you were wondering about that. Quite a few. But the other part of this reporting section is, well, who is actually getting these reports? And I broke this down into 4 different categories. Local, so town and city. So when you look at the department, does it have a name of a town or city? So the Leechburg Police Department, the Clearwater Police Department, the Los Angeles Police Department, New York City Police Department, those all, despite them being a wide range of populations, are what I would consider to be local police. So local police, county/sheriff police, state police, of course, mainly here in the United States, and then federal police. So here in the United States, it would be the FBI. In Canada, that would be the RCMP as an example. 52% of Unfound's disappearances were reported at the local level, so town or city. Over 50% of them, just over 50%, 52% at the local level, town, city, whatever you want to call it. But you may be wondering, well, what about the FBI? Well, I do have the federal, and for the federal, it's 6%. So 6% of all of Unfound's disappearances have been reported and are being investigated at the federal level. However, the 6% number is greatly skewed by the disappearances in Canada, because we've featured quite a few, at least 10 or something in Canada. But all of those are under the jurisdiction of the federal police, the RCMP. And so they all go into the federal category, which is in the same category as the FBI in the United States. But if you take out all of the Canadian disappearances, the FBI itself is only responsible for less than 1% of Unfound's disappearances. I didn't have to put the exact number here in my notes, but it is a very, very, very low percentage. And this does go in line with what Julia Colley said when she was on the podcast, how she worked the FBI 25 years, and she only looked at a handful of disappearances in her time there. As Americans, our perceptions of disappearances and the FBI being involved are skewed because of Hollywood. In reality, the FBI has very, very, very little to do with disappearances. Even though they do, it's just not very prominent. As we see here, over 50% of disappearances, it would be local police who have the reports and do the investigation. Maybe sometimes they get help from the FBI, maybe sometimes. But still, the report is in local hands, and these men and women are the ones responsible. So I thought that was very interesting. And once again, this is something that I'm not sure has ever been looked at in depth until I started documenting it. And, of course, with Kathy and then myself putting all of these facts together. And this is also noteworthy because we know that at the local level, most of those places departments do not have missing persons units. Yes, LA does. Yes, New York does. Maybe Chicago does. But most do not. Even somewhat fairly large departments in the United States don't have them. And certainly at the local level, there is no such thing. The cop who is taking a cat out of a tree one day is responsible for a missing persons case the next, and then the day after that, it's a car wreck. This is how it works at the local level. And now that we know it's 52% of all disappearances, this should be a great concern to us that they all have the right knowledge. Relationships. Anybody who has been following Unfound for any period of time knows that I put a lot of stock in the belief that relationships are the number one cause of disappearances. I think you don't even have to have maybe a database to realize that relationships are the number one cause of disappearances, whether it has to do with marriage, boyfriend and girlfriend, exes, even business partners, maybe to a much lesser extent, jilted lovers, friendships that go badly. All of it is under the category of relationships. But what does that actually mean? Well, first of all, of the 385 disappearances, and by the way, we're only going to consider adults for this, 219 people featured on Unfound were either married or dating in some kind of relationship. Doesn't matter, hetero, sexual or homosexual, doesn't matter. Although that's another fact. We haven't covered many disappearances of gays or lesbians, anyone in those groups. Why that is, that's just the way it's worked out to this point after 9 years. But 219 people who were married / dating, living together, something like that. That means of the rest of the adults, 126 were single. We're not including children in any of these stats. So what actually are the stats on this? The fact is that being married increases your chance of disappearing by 17%. In addition, though, if you're single, going missing decreases your chances by 19%. And what that means is of the general population, there's a certain percentage who are married. The fact is it's a higher percentage of people who are in the disappearance group. So let's just say, I don't have the stats in front of me, although I know them. I didn't put them in the notes here. Let's say that 25% of the population is married or dating, something like that. That's just a random number. But in the group here for Unfound of all the adults, there's 219 out of, I think, 332 or something. So it's a much higher percentage. Whereas for the single group, single adults in the general population, I think it's like 48% of adults are single. They only make up 30-some% of Unfound's adult missing. Very, very interesting. I know that's going to be a part of this database that is going to get a lot more study from me. But those are the general statistics. Being married increases your chances of going missing by about 17%. Moving on, here's something that's interesting that I found within the statistics. Of this group, 38 women, adult women, who went missing were married at the time. Over half of them were last seen by their husbands. Some of those women would be Gayla Shaper, Angela Green, Julianne Gillet, Patricia Otto, once again, just to name a few. So over 50%. However, if we look at the 77 women, adult women, who were just dating, who just had boyfriends, they might have been living together, but just in the general category of having a significant other, but not married, there were 77 of them, and only 25 of them were last seen by the men in their lives. So in one, it's for married women, it's over 50%, but for women who are just dating, it's only 33%. Some of those women would be Shannon Boydo, Mary Lands, Joey Offit, Irene Gakwa. Why the discrepancy, though, between the married women at 50% and the dating women, committed relationships but no paperwork, no oath between them, only 33%? I think it's because a lot of times when you're dating somebody, you're not living with that person. And of course, I'm inclined to believe a lot of these women, the married women, their disappearances were caused by their husbands. With the women who are just dating, obviously if you're not living together, that makes maybe the boyfriend causing the girlfriend's disappearance to be a little more difficult. Gonna have to look more into that, but I think part of it is a lot of women who are dating men are not living with them. So maybe if they go missing and it's not the boyfriend's fault, the boyfriend maybe isn't going to be the last person to see the woman. Something to think about. Let's move on to education. And I brought this up very early on in this episode. This was an eye-opener. Although I'm not necessarily surprised, but the stats on this are something. So, of the 278 eligible people who could have graduated from college, meaning anybody in the disappearances that Unfound has covered, anybody who is 21 and over, who would be college graduate eligible, unless you got some, of course, prodigy or something, but just in general, there are 278 adults 21 and over that Unfound has featured. There are only, of that 278, there are only 33 college graduates. Only 33. And that's about 11.8%. Whereas in the general population, at least of the United States, 38% of the general population of adults has graduated from college. But for disappearances, at least according to Unfound stats, only about 12% are college graduates. Meaning, if you are a college graduate, you decrease your chances of going missing by 26 percentage points or by 2/3. In fact, it's even bigger than if we were talking about relationships, single, married. If you are a college graduate, man or woman, the odds of you going missing greatly, greatly diminish. Fascinating. Some of those people who, though, did go missing with college diplomas. Mandy Stokes, of course, she had some drug issues. Kyle Fleischman, Charlotte, North Carolina. He was out drinking that night. Some people believe it was foul play. Andrea Knable, of course, she also had some drug issues. Andy Chapman also had some drug issues and hanging around the wrong people. So once again, of the 278 people who would be eligible to have graduated from college, so at 21 years old and over, there are only 33 college graduates in Unfound's entire catalog. 12%, whereas the general population, 38%. Fascinating. In contrast, so here's the contrast. Out of the 362 people who could be eligible to have made it to high school, so we talk high school age of like 16 and over, or in school at any level, we have 362 adults, period. We have 87 of them who did not graduate high school. That is 24%. So of the people who are eligible to even be in high school of that age and up, 24% of them did not graduate from high school. Whereas the general population of the United States, only 9% of the general population has not graduated from high school. Meaning if you've not graduated from high school for whatever reason, your chances of missing have increased by, 15 percentage points, or about 300%. So 9 to 18, 27, not quite 300%. That is a crazy statistic. Stay in school. Get your diploma. Go to college. Graduate. And your odds of going missing greatly, greatly, greatly diminished. 3 times more likely to disappear if you haven't graduated from high school. Some of those people: Tonova Ross, April Pitzer, Chris Gully, Chase Lackey. Next category that I want to cover: mental health. Now, something that is very important to understand, and I'll make this much clearer when I do the video on how to use the database and what all these things, the labels and everything mean. This is not a scientific study in mental health, meaning when we're talking about mental health for purposes of this database, the person did not have to have some sort of official diagnosis, going to a psychiatrist or hospital or anything to be diagnosed. Instead, what I used is just what the guest said. Did it seem like this person had a mental health issue, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia? Because, of course, a lot of these things might be private. It very well may be that some of these missing people did get diagnosed officially but never told anybody. So that would make all of this very difficult. So for purposes of this database, we're just going by what the people who knew them said about these people. Their best insights, very layperson observation, but these are people who are around these people. And let's just admit, with enough people these days having mental health issues, it very well could be the average person on the street has a pretty good idea of the signs of schizophrenia and bipolar disorder and depression and all of that. And, of course, the other part of it is, how do you separate mental health from drug problems? Because, of course, a lot of that can be very, very mixed. We've had several disappearances where the person had a drug addiction and mental health issues. Well, which started which, and how do you break that down? Very difficult to do. I tried to do the best I could with it for this database. But for mental health, 85, and we just went with adults here, so 333 adults. 85 out of the 333 adults had some sort of mental health issue, 25%. But the general population, it's almost the same number, at least for the United States, 23%. However, we've always gone forward, thought the idea, well, if you have a mental health issue, that really, really raises your chances of going missing. But at first glance, it doesn't seem like that is the truth. We have a general population, 23% of the population with mental health issues, but only a couple percent more looking at unfound disappearances. Why is there not a bigger difference? Why isn't it like 50% for unfound missing people, or 40%? Why is it the numbers are the numbers almost the same, the percentage? I think the flaw in this, and I don't know how this can be fixed, what we're not really gauging in this database is, well, where are these people who had mental health issues taking their medication or not? I think that if it was more of a comparison between the general population at 23% and those people who have been covered by Unfound, who seemingly had mental health issues and went missing, how many of those people were not taking their medication? In contrast to the people who do take their medication. I think that's probably more accurate. It is what it is for now, but I think this is the reason for this. I think what we would discover is that in the general population, much higher percentage of people who have been diagnosed with mental health issues are actually taking their medication. Whereas if we had a better handle on whether these people with these mental health issues were taking their medication, I think we would find out many of them were not. And I realize that has come up in some interviews, but this is also one of those things where some guests surely would know, but a lot of other guests would not. They'd only know if they saw that person every day, knew what their prescription was seeing the pill bottle and all of that. And that might be a little too much for most family members or friends to know. So this is interesting. Little bit of maybe, once again, I realize this isn't totally perfect. Very difficult, as you can tell, to put this all together. But this is one maybe of the weaknesses of the database at this point. This whole idea of mental health, and maybe need to get more, deeper into people taking their medication or not. Maybe that would be a better marker. A better way to study this part of disappearances. It's just not in the database right now, and I'm not sure even if we were to collect that information, be able to go back and take a look at these interviews again, what people said, I still don't know how accurate the information collected would be. So there's that. Moving on, let's talk now about addiction. I need to make the point again that this is not a doctor's diagnosis or anything like that. When I say addiction, this is simply when it comes up during interviews. When I ask a guest, did the person have an addiction? I heard the person have an addiction. In a previous conversation, you told me that this person had a problem with drugs. This is what I'm talking about. There is nothing having to do with rehab. Did they go to rehab? Did they leave rehab? Were they going to go to rehab? Did they blow off rehab? Did rehab work for a while? And then nothing like that. It was simply, at the time of the disappearance, did these people, in your opinion, have addictions? And I do drugs and alcohol, both of them. So let's get into that now. For drugs, of the adults, 126 of the adults, about 1/3. Of those, 75 were men, so about 60%. Some of those men would be Zach Carey. Of course, he was recently found deceased. Ronnie Russell, Noah Davis, who also his remains were found, and Brian Sullivan. And so, once again, 75 were men. Of course, the rest, that's 60%. We had 40. The rest, of course, the other 40% are women, and I did not put any of their names in here. So that's drugs alone, drug addiction. Doesn't matter if it's legal or illegal. It's just all one category, drug addiction. Whether it's heroin or, abusing prescription drugs, it's all the same. How about alcohol only? Only alcoholics. Only 58. And in contrast to the drugs with 126. And of course, we have to believe that alcoholism is a bigger problem overall, at least for most of these from the United States, than drug addiction is. I think the problem here is that, I think what we're seeing here is that alcoholics aren't as likely to go missing as drug addicts are. And I also think that people who are addicted to alcohol, may be harder to tell. If somebody's drinking all the time, does that mean that person is an alcoholic or not? In contrast to, if you know a person's doing heroin, you know that person's an addict. So we have to wade through all of that. But once again, only 58 of the adults featured, or of drinking age, 21 and up, were considered to be alcoholics by the people who knew them. 28 men, but here's the interesting thing, 30 women. More women than men were alcoholics, at least in Unfound's catalog of disappearances. So 58, 28 men, 30 women. Why is this? Hard for me to say right at this point. I was stunned by this. I did not see that coming at all. Now, you may be wondering, well, who are some of the women who were alcoholics? And once again, this is beer, alcohol, any alcohol at all, only. Susan Carter. Of course, she was found deceased with her daughter. Sue Braddock. Remember her? A Florida disappearance, believed. Ilea Boomer. And Elaine Johnson. Of course, Elaine Johnson, possibly one idea is that she was drunk in her place, her apartment, and went down the trash chute. I'm not telling you to believe that. That's just one idea. Her daughter was the guest. Let's move on to this. How about drug-alcohol combo? Well, of the 342 people eligible in the database for this to be considered, it's 35 out of 342, so like 10% of the adults featured had the drug-alcohol combo. Who are some of those people? Matthew Tuttle. Marty Evans, of course, woman Martha Marty Evans featured recently. Crystal Bailey and Carl Schooner Jr., that's a Canadian disappearance. So let's now look at the opposite of that. We had 172 out of the 342 where drugs and alcohol were not prominently noted at all. It did not come up. They were not believed to be having an addiction, at least to nothing chemical. Maybe they had a gambling addiction or a sex addiction, but for purposes of disappearances, I'm just thinking about alcohol and drugs. 172 out of 342 were drugs and alcohol not prominently noted in any of the discussions. Of course, that is 50%. What is the general population? General population, at least in the United States, who do not have alcohol or drug addictions, is 83%. So, being sober is a spectacular way to keep from disappearing. So, once again, get your college education. And then after that, stay away from drugs and alcohol. Now, I know you may be saying, well, some of these things aren't that surprising. Well, everybody knows, if you get your education, you're probably going to have a better life. It's going to be more orderly. And there's going to be more structure and more likely to have good relationships and everything else. That's true. But I think what we're also saying is the general methodology for this database is correct. Even though I kind of just came up with this off the top of my head, what we're seeing here kind of goes in line with generally accepted principles. And what I think this also means is when we really start to get into the deeper stats on this, those thus are going to be correct as well, because this, scratching the surface here, just like I said, Missing Persons 101, these things are turning out to line up pretty good, and I'm very excited about this. That the general principles are true, which probably means those deeper mysteries are going to be true as well. So once again, if you don't have any addictions, don't have any, no drugs, no alcohol in your life, the odds of you going missing drop considerably. Like I said, it's only 50% it's 50% of the people. It's just not that prominent within the missing persons community. Still, it's a considerable percentage, but we have to remember we're starting with 83% of the population that doesn't have any alcohol or drug addictions anyway. It's a pretty big section, at least of the United States, even though I know we cover Canada and some other areas. It doesn't mean they aren't addicted to gambling, and maybe it just isn't something that I really ever get into or ask. And sex addiction, we have all sorts of addictions out there. But at least for those two, I think this is very, very interesting. All right, employment. in this section. So of the people who were work eligible, so I put that at 16 years old and above. There were 79 16. So what you do is in the database, I put in age 16 and above. And then I go down to the work job part and I say anybody who has a job, no job. 79, 16 and over people who were featured on Unfound did not have jobs. That is 25%. Of people 16 and over who have been featured on Unfound, 79 of them had no job. 25%. Whereas the average unemployment over the past 80 years, so we have to go back to Mary Jane Van Gilder, the oldest disappearance up to the present, 80 years. The average unemployment, at least in the United States, has been about 8%. But here at Unfound, it's 25%. If you don't have a job, your odds of going missing go up by 3 times. How about that? So once again, kind of falling in line with what we kind of think, which once again proves, I think that this database is very, very solid. And, looking at the way I've chosen to look at all this, very, very solid numbers on which to build even more complex ideas. We got the base of this. Maybe you want to think of like a building or a pyramid or something. The base of this is very solid on solid ground. It's engineered correctly. So once again, the unemployment rate over the last 80 years is about 8%, whereas it's 25% of Unfound's adults, 16 and over, did not have jobs at the time of their disappearances. You get a job, if you're working, the odds of you going missing drop considerably. Let's move on to this. How about cars? Now, I've told you, even though I didn't know necessarily what the exact statistics are, I told you that people who go missing with their cars is very rare. Now, what I used here was, what is the stipulation? What does a lost car mean? For purposes of this disappearance, if the car, so as you know, for me to consider disappearances for Unfound, the disappearance has to be a year old. So this would be any disappearance where at the end of a year, the person and the car were missing. So this would not mean, for example, somebody goes missing with a car. If the car is found a month later, but the person is still missing a year later, that doesn't count as a car being missing. Cars being missing only counts if the person in the car is still missing after at least a year. So, for example, Eric Franks, of course, he goes missing, his car goes missing, and then years later his car is found. That's considered to be a missing car. On the other hand, Zoe Campos, she and her car go missing, and then her car is found in that apartment parking lot, what was a few days later, a week later, that does not count as a car being missing. So of the 358, and what that would mean is anybody 16 years old and above, anybody at the driver eligible age and above. Only 16 out of 358 eligible disappearances was a car still missing after a year. That is it. 16. Some of those would be Harry Milligan. Of course, he and his car are still missing. Tammy Arthur and Chad Peters, they're still missing. Their car is still missing. Nancy Troche Garcia, she and her car are still missing. Jeff Joseph, he and his car are still missing. In contrast to, of course, Esther Westenbarger would be included in this as well. She and her car went missing. Of course, she and her car were found. I already brought up Eric Franks. He would be in here even though his car has been found. It was found years later. He is also part of this 16 out of 358. What's the percentage on that? 4.4%. That's it. That's it. And this is something that I've been saying even though I didn't have the exact statistics because I didn't have this database made and everything. So when you watch Chaos Divers and Adventures with Purpose, they're all doing great work. I'll continue to say that. But I will continue to remind you that the disappearances they are working on are some of the rarest kinds of disappearances. Rarest, not the rarest maybe, but a rare type where a person and a car go missing together and they're missing for over a year. Unfound statistics shows it's only 4.4% of all disappearances. That's of adults. That's it. Meaning, to put it another way, 95.6% of disappearances do not include cars being missing for more than a year. I think this is noteworthy. Like I said, it's exactly what I've been telling you, even though I necessarily didn't have the exact numbers. And like I said, I've already named some of those disappearances to give you an example, just to, once again, to remind you of what we're talking about here. So we're almost to the end here, and so I'm calling this section the secret sauce, because with this database, you can use criteria in just one category, in 10 categories, or all 33 categories. You can check off something in all 3 categories to see if any names come up. And this is what I call the secret sauce. And I have not done that yet. I've not clicked off everything in every particular criteria yet. But just to give you an example, we're going to do a little quiz. All right. So, like I said, to remind you, you can combine more than one criteria. You can have a woman between the ages of 21 and 40 who was married, who had a job, who might have had an addiction, whose car is also missing. You can click that off and see if there are any of Unfound's disappearances that fit into those specific criteria. Well, I'm going to pick out this one. I just randomly picked this out, and it came up with only one disappearance. And I'm gonna give you the criteria, and I'm gonna give it a couple seconds, and I'm gonna see. Of course, you can stop playing this recording to try to figure out which one it is if you'd like. But I'll give you some seconds to try to think about it, and then I will tell you which disappearance it is. Here's a random one. She is female. She is between the ages of 25 and 40. She's married. She went missing at night. Her ID is missing. Yes, that is a criteria. Is the missing person's ID gone, or was it left behind somewhere? This woman's ID is still missing. She was a high school grad, and the county sheriff is responsible for her disappearance. Regarding those criteria, once again, woman 25 to 40, married at the time of her disappearance. She disappeared at night. ID is missing. She's a high school grad, and the county/sheriff is responsible into the investigation of this woman's disappearance. Can you name this unfound disappearance? And I will also tell you this disappearance is still unsolved. Who is she? I'll give you the answer in 5 seconds. 1001, 1002, 1003, 1004, 1005. Once again, I'll go over it. Female. She's between the ages of 25 and 40. Married. She disappeared at night. Her ID is still missing. She's a high school grad, and the local the sheriff for that county where she went missing is responsible for the investigation of her disappearance. This woman is Danielle Sleeper. And what's interesting about this, in fact, if I were to change this if I would have said, I'm looking for all the same criteria, except I'm looking for same type of woman, but the local police is responsible instead of the county police, the search would have come up with 0 matches. So this is how when you start tweaking these things within all these checklists and boxes and everything, how much a difference can be made. And of course, if I were to switch this to male, who knows what the results would be. If I change the, age from 41 to 60, who knows how many would pop up, or single, or any one of these criteria that I use for this particular search. How would it vary? Would it be 1? Would it be 0? Would it be 5? This is how this all works, and I am fascinated by all of it, as you can tell. So this is kind of where we are. Now, what is also interesting to me, we're going to take a look and see what are those items that make it more likely for people to go missing. I've talked about some of this already. We talked about the criteria that make it less likely that a person will go missing, like education, job. Where, the criteria within the criteria, is there anything that balances things out? What if a person has an addiction but is also working? What if the person, so an addiction raises your chances of going missing, but working decreases your chances of going missing? Which one wins out? What if a person has a mental illness but has a job? Does it matter if a certain level of law enforcement investigates the same kind of disappearance? So we could take a look at a list of disappearances using certain criteria and look to see which ones are being investigated by local police, like the city or town, and look at the same criteria, but disappearances they're the responsibility of a sheriff's office. How do those compare? Who is better at resolving disappearances? And I should go back to the reporting part. I think what's important to glean from local and city having 52% of the reports of unfound disappearances, if we were to start education for cops, of course we should start there, because it seems they handle more than a majority of disappearances. It doesn't seem very efficient to start at the state level or even the county level. You need to start with cities and towns. So whether it's a little town like Leechburg that has its police department of just a couple people, or the whole way up to LA, for purposes of this database, it's the same. You're better to start with departments like that if you want to educate police officers, because they're going to handle most of a majority of these reports. Very, very interesting. Go on and on and on with this. Like I said, this is just Missing Persons 101, and I think we have a long way to go on this. And certainly, there's going to be criteria that's going to be added as I go. Now that I have a better understanding of how all of this works. And I would also say, once it becomes public, I'll get into that then, but certainly there probably are some mistakes. As you can tell, a huge amount of information was collected over the last 2 years. It is unreal, the amount of work that Kathy did, and then I followed up, finish it. And so mistakes are going to be made. In addition, there certainly are some things in here where they're unknowns. There's certainly criteria where it just didn't come up in some disappearances. So any families out there who get to use it and they go to their particular disappearance and find, I can help fill in this blank, it's just going to make the database even more accurate. So I realize there's probably some mistakes in there, but there's some blanks there because, like I said, we just didn't cover it. Didn't come up. And hopefully, so as we proceed, this database, I think, is going to get more and more accurate, and it's going to become more extensive because I'm going to keep, of course, as Unfound continues, we're going to keep adding more and more disappearances to this. So, conclusions so far, at least on the surface, just scratching the surface here, certainly some interesting points. I don't know if there's necessarily anything that's mind-blowing, But I think that's good because, like I said, it shows that the premise for the database is sound and the facts that have been gathered are relevant. And where is this going? Well, to bring up that UK book that I'm continuing to read, like I said, I'm about 2/3 of the way through it. That this book, and as far as I can tell, this is the most complete book that has ever been written about the study of disappearances, studies and everything. This book doesn't come close to any of this. At all. At all. In fact, this book, it doesn't even have anything to do, doesn't say anything about disappearances that are probably murders. I'm 2/3 of the way through this book, not one word on that yet, which blows my mind. But I think the book doesn't come close to this, and I don't think, it's going to be hard for any particular book, quote unquote, to come close to this because there's no specifics. In this book, they don't talk about specific disappearances like if you were reading a page at the Charlie Project. It doesn't do that. I think this is very important, to be able to know the intricacies of individual disappearances. In this book, there's no specifics about any particular disappearance. There's no actual disappearances listed. And disappearances that are murders are not even discussed in this book, at least to this point, 2/3 of the way through. So what comes next? What do I have to do? Well, like I said, I have to do a video on how all of you, I'm not going to just put it out there, and I need to give you some guidance because a lot of you maybe are not as smooth on computers as other people are. And I want to make sure that anybody who wants to use this has a decent understanding of it. I don't want anybody to get frustrated within 10 minutes of using it. I don't want this database to only be used by computer experts. Certainly not. And it doesn't matter if you have a Mac or a Chrome OS or a laptop or a Dell laptop or whatever else. Or you'll be able to use it on your phone as well. So I have to do a video on how to use this database. I have to figure out how to put it online in a way that's easy to use. Like I said, it's probably going to go on the website, theunfoundpodcast.com. I have to make sure how to share it. I have to make sure that it's going to work if a lot of people use it all at the same time. Like bandwidth, I guess is what I'm talking about. So, and once all of that is figured out, we're going to be in a very, very solid place with this. Very excited about this. And this really, like I said, this is exactly what I envisioned, like I said, 5-6 years ago when it popped into my head while I was watching the movie Moneyball. My vision way, way down the road, if we could make it happen, is to have an app on your phone or an app on the phone that the police would have on their phones. I'm serious. That when they show up, instead of filling out a report, they'd have an app. They ask the questions that are on the app. Female, this age. Did she have this addiction? Blah, 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 blah. Do all this yes or no, age. Put in the age. Who last saw her? Just once again, clicking like you would do on any app. And then once you enter in all the information, it would be able to spit out what are the odds of this person coming back, being alive, being deceased. What are the odds of this person coming back all on his own or her own? What are the odds this person ran off and ran away and has started a new life somewhere? This, I think, conceptually, of course, with the use of AI or whatever else, I'm going to choose not to be afraid of AI. This is really, really going to help, I think, investigations. It's really going to narrow this down instead of when police show up, fill the paperwork, well, you just don't know what happened. Well, continuing to accumulate information is going to put it better into focus on what needs to be done. I really believe that. And this is where it starts. And that's the program. I'm Ed Densel, and you've been listening to Unfound.